playing trade, international trade, in terms of differences in factor endowments. So what we have to see then is what difference does changing the factor endowments have in terms of the production possibilities curve, and therefore what it means for comparative advantage. So we're going to assume here that the supply of capital is increased. Now we're also going to make some simplifying assumptions. These, by the way, are not necessarily true, but we want to start this way to see what happens. So the first of these assumptions is that the relative price of cloth is fixed or constant. That the relative factor returns are fixed. And finally, that the labor supply is fixed. Now, we're going to continue with number 3, but 1 and 2 we'll relax in just a minute. Okay, so remember what we've done is increase the amount of capital. But remember, the vertical dimensions of this box tell us how much capital we have. So if we've increased the amount of capital, we now have to have a higher box. So let's leave our 0 point for machinery constant. And to get that higher box, then, we'll just lift this box up, raise it by the amount of new capital. So this is the change in the capital that we've acquired. Now notice the 0 point now has to move up to here, and the maximum capital has to move up to here, and labor up to here. Now the other thing that we have to drag higher is our CC curve. Right? I mean, it's coming out of the origin for the clothing industry, so if we've lifted the origin to the clothing industry, we've got to pull that line up too. Remember, one of our assumptions was that relative factor returns were being held constant, which also means that relative factor proportions will be constant. So the slope of the line doesn't change. So the whole line is just going to shift up as we expand our box. Now notice, right here, point B is going to give us, so it's where the proportions meet, so that it'll tell us what the output or the labor in capital components will be. So notice that manufacturing, the number of manufacturing workers increases. The amount of capital in manufacturing increases. The amount of capital in clothing decreases. It's not that full amount. And the number of workers in clothing decreases. So notice what happened. We increased the amount of capital in this economy. Machinery is a capital-intensive industry. It's going to actually use all of the new capital. It's also going to steal some capital from the clothing industry. But it has a capital-to-labor ratio. If it's going to use more capital, it also has to have some more workers. So it's also stealing some workers from the clothing industry. Okay? So again, we add more capital to the economy. Capital is going to be used primarily in the machinery industry. But that additional machinery actually requires additional workers. The only place for those workers to come from is the clothing industry. But as the clothing industry loses workers, it will also lose some of its capital. So we end up with a situation where the machinery industry has a lot more capital and more workers, and the clothing industry actually has less capital and fewer workers. Okay? So, just to highlight, the quantity of capital in the clothing industry falls. Quantity of labor in clothing falls. So the clothing industry actually has fewer resources, which of course also means that it has less output. The amount of capital in the machinery industry rises, and the amount of labor in machinery rises. So notice that machinery, the amount of machinery output will rise more than proportionally to the increase in capital. Machinery output will rise more than proportionally to the increase in capital. Okay, so here's an initial production possibilities frontier. I've tried to draw this production possibilities frontier so that there is no noticeable comparative advantage. That is, with the resources that we have, the maximum amount of clothing is equal to the maximum amount of machinery. So can't tell anything from this in terms of productivity in either industry. But what we've just seen is that when we increase the amount of capital, that our production possibilities is what we have to think about. What happens to our production possibilities? Well, as we increase capital, we should be able to also increase the output of clothing. Assume that we're not going to make any machinery at all. That is, we're going to be at this point on machinery. We got more capital. Now we can use that additional capital to make more clothing. But clothing's labor intensive. So the capital is not going to be sort of the driving force in terms of what's happening in the clothing industry. So clothing might increase, maximum amount might increase by only that amount. Now, if we did just the opposite, let's put all the machinery and all the workers in the economy, all the capital and all the workers in the economy into the machinery industry. Well, with all this new capital coming in, and machinery being capital intensive, we'll get a big increase in the total amount of machinery that can be produced, way out here. So this production possibilities frontier has a biased expansion towards machinery. So this increase in capital leads to a biased expansion towards the quantity of machinery, or towards machinery. Now remember, we also made an assumption that the relative price of clothing is fixed. Okay, this is an assumption, but what we can show is that if I drew this correctly, fairly close, so this ISO value line, or budget ISO value, same slope. Okay, point B. And here's what we can show, is that the quantity of machinery being produced will increase dramatically, and the quantity of cloth being produced will actually fall. So if we increase a factor of production, we will get a biased expansion in the output of that good that uses that factor intensely. If we get an increase in a factor of production, we will get a biased increase in the output of that good which uses that factor intensely. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, except that would probably come through changes in prices. Okay? Since we don't think of gasoline necessarily as a production resource. Okay? Yes. At the same relative prices. We've held relative prices constant here. So we can only say that if relative prices don't change. Okay? Okay. So notice what happened. Remember with the Ricardian model, one of our kind of easy ways to tell when a country had a comparative advantage was to look at the bias of its production possibilities frontier. You knew that a country had a comparative advantage in a good if its production possibilities frontier was biased in one direction or the other. Well, notice what we've just done. If we started with two countries that are essentially identical, so that their production possibilities frontiers look exactly the same. They have the same resource endowment, they have the same production technology, everything is the same. So their production possibilities frontiers are identical. Now, what happens if we change the resource endowments? If we give one country, call it the United States, more capital. We give another country, call it China, more labor. Well, the US then would be capital abundant. If we were capital abundant, we will end up having a production possibilities curve that is biased towards those goods that are capital intensive in their production. China would have a production possibilities curve that would be biased towards those goods that were labor intensive. So production technologies can stay the same, and with different factor endowments, we can still end up with a comparative advantage in the production of some good, simply by having different factor intensities and different factor endowments. Now, one thing to notice here, this is the relative quantity of manufactured goods increased with this increase in capital, the factor endowment. Okay? We haven't changed the price yet, the relative price yet. Well, we started here. We started at QM, QC black, and we ended up huge increase here, a decrease here. So this relative increase, this relative quantity increased as the capital stock increased. Okay. So again, just to highlight, an increase in capital will disproportionately increase machinery production. And there it is drawn a little bit cleaner. And it will disproportionately reduce, this is an increase in the supply of labor will disproportionately increase clothing production. So had we changed labor rather than capital, this is what we would have seen. The production possibilities frontier would have shifted out, but not very much in the way of capital, and a lot in the way of in machinery, but a lot in the direction of clothing. And with the same relative price, the output of clothing will increase quite dramatically, and the output of machinery will actually decline. Okay, so let's finish with the Rybinski theorem, everybody's favorite, especially if you can pronounce it. So what the Rybinski theorem says is essentially what we've just seen. If, this is an important if, we're not saying that this is true, that relative prices don't change, but if the relative prices don't change, then the relative factors of production will not change, and an increase in the one factor output will give us a disproportionate increase in the output of the good that uses that factor intensively. That's essentially just what we saw in those diagrams, just what we saw. Now, the Rybinski theorem is important because it gives us that starting point. Again, I don't want to leave you with the impression that if all of these changes took place, there would be no changes in relative prices. There would be changes in relative prices. But what we want to see is what would happen if we hold relative prices constant. Again, what we see is for the capital abundant country, in our example, the US, will have a larger relative quantity of machinery produced compared to China. China is labor abundant. It will have a higher relative quantity of clothing produced. So simply having different factor endowments will give us different relative supplies of goods and services in the economy. Okay, this is a reasonably good place to stop. Let me talk about your problem set, which is due next Tuesday and will be posted on BSpace tomorrow sometime in the morning. I've been working on it madly, having lots of fun, dreaming up brand new situations. So look for the problem set on BSpace tomorrow, and I'll talk more about it in terms of what we're looking for in class on Thursday.